button, so I'm thinking about that. Again, I'm glad to see all of you here and taking this class. I have really enjoyed studying, getting ready for this class for Proverbs. And again, the deeper I get, the more I realize there's no way we're going to be able to cover everything up to the point that I'd like to. But part of the reason why I like to teach in the Georgia School of Preaching and so forth is to challenge myself to be better and to be a better teacher and to get to know more. And again, it seems like I've preached on Proverbs before. And most of the time, whenever we hear people preach on Proverbs, we'll deal with one specific issue like the tongue or something like that. But when you really get into the detail of these first 9 chapters, where he's talking about the ideal of wisdom and trying to give advice to a young man, as you really get into this, it really is something that I've come to the realization of that we need to hear more of in the Lord's church today. This whole ideal of wisdom, the ideal of what righteousness is, what justice is. Think about the idea that the word justice is being thrown around by everybody on the political spectrum as to what justice is. And the only place that we can really define what justice is from the Bible, from the God who's given us the moral code that we are to live by. If it is, as so many claim, that we have no moral code because there is no God, then it becomes what? It becomes the moral code of the majority of the people. And if that's the case, then we really had no moral justification to condemn Hitler, to condemn Stalin, to condemn all these other nations in the world that have been mistreating their subjects for years and years and years. There's no moral standard to say that that's absolutely wrong. Proverbs comes across with the idea, look, God is the one who created the heavens and the earth. God is the one who has set the moral code into existence. And therefore we need to gain wisdom, to gain understanding, to gain justice, know what justice is, what judgment is, what real equity is, chapter 1 at verse 3. We need to get back to what God says all these things are and teach it again to everybody that we have the opportunity to come in contact with. So today we're starting, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm trying to look at my notes here, we're going to pick up with chapter 1, and I think we're going to start dealing with about verse 20. I think last week we began to talk about the idea. Chapter 1, verses 10 through 14 was a warning against gangsterism, as I would call it, as James Smith did in his book, Wisdom Literature. Excuse me. We talked about the fact, and these are some things I very briefly mentioned, the reason why they encourage so many young people to get involved. They offer excitement. They offer empowerment. They offer enrichment. They offer camaraderie. And you think about how today so many gangs in prisons as well as in the world are offering these things to young people that need some sort of a family. But he also emphasizes, verses 15 through 19, that here's what's going to happen to those that are engaged in this. He will emphasize, my son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your foot from their path. And again, we're reminded of Psalms 1 at verse 1, where the psalmist will begin the entire book of Psalms. And I think Psalm chapter 1 is really the whole key to what he's going to be trying to do in the Psalms, where he says, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is what? In the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. So here you have the proverb writer starting off, in a sense, in the very same way. Again, if most of the Psalms were written by David, David could very well have passed a lot of this on to his son, and a lot of the things that we've talked about in the introduction comes into play here, because some of this could have simply come from David talking to his son. And now Solomon is passing this on to his son. So he emphasizes, don't walk in the way with them. Here's what's going to happen. Don't even take a step in that direction. Here's what's going to happen. It's like the birds. You could set a net out for the birds and then throw the corn out there, and they're going to come in there and take it, and you can catch the birds. The same way is going to happen with those that are engaged in this kind of activity. they know that somewhere down the line they're going to be caught, but they don't really care. And really, it shows how all of these people are greedy for gain. Think about, again, how this so is applicable in American society today. It's all about gain and money and getting more money. I'm sure if you've listened to the news at all, you probably have heard the discussion now about Apple, who said in essence that, we're not supporting iPhone 4, and they actually have a certain limit how far all their phones will be, be able to function with all the updates they're going to do. And Apple will tell you, there are some things called obsolescence that's going to be factored into our products. Well, for that to happen, then you've got to buy their newer products. And you got the iPhone 10 now, which is $999 just in and of and by itself. And it's like $1,000 for a phone? I don't think so. So again, this is kind of thing, this greedy for gain. And so again, as he starts off this very important idea to his son here in chapter 1, he's emphasizing, don't get involved with this. But on the other hand, what should you do? Well, beginning in chapter 20, or chapter 1 at verse 20, and going through 33, he talks about wisdom. And again, he's personifying her. Now, we talked about very briefly the idea, again in the introduction, that if you listen to what the proverb writer says about wisdom, the only person that you could really say ever fit that in a actual life would be who? It would be Jesus Christ. So as we understand it from that viewpoint, that helps us to understand that here wisdom is personified. Personified in this case as a woman. Wisdom calls aloud outside. She raises her voice in the open square. So here wisdom is personified as a woman. And in some commentaries you will see the idea that she's called Lady Wisdom. Okay? And again, we can understand why in this context, because he's talking about she all the way through here. All righty? As I said before, some have seen that wisdom personified as Jesus. Again, maybe rather than looking at and for a specific person, we need to take the ideal of wisdom being an abstract concept, yet at the same time bringing out the important parts of it. Wisdom is also something that we know is divine. God has all knowledge. God has all wisdom. We cannot tell God what to do, how to do certain things. Wisdom is divine. And when wisdom is out there, wisdom will be heard by the righteous person when it calls. So notice she starts off. She calls aloud outside, in the open squares, in the chief concourses, in the openings of the gates of the city. So you're looking at 4 different places here, and it's like every one of these places are not hidden in a corner. It's not in a private situation. These things are preached as it was openly. So really when you get down to it, as this one brother has said, Lady Wisdom competes with worldly wisdom in the marketplace of ideas. And really, when you get down to it, is that not exactly what we're trying to do when we spread the gospel? You've got a lot of different ideas that's out there, a lot of different ideas and concepts. And what we have to do, and isn't it interesting that our Lord will emphasize to us that we are to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature? Well, where does that start? Go back and look through the book of Acts. They started in the marketplace. They started in the temple. They started in these public places. And then they were able to go there and go from there and maybe talk, as Paul would say later in Acts 20:20, I taught you publicly and from house to house. So we need to realize that God's will, God's word, needs to be brought out there boldly in the marketplace of ideas. So thinking about it that there, it's not transmitted to a small band of people. But again, it's out there in the entrance of the gates, where the elders sit at the gates of the city to discuss community policy. It's all there. And so what does he do? Verse 3 to verse 22. wisdom should appeal to three classes. First off, how long, you simple ones? And again, looking back there, I'm looking if you're, how long, oh simple ones, will you love being simple? We talked about the idea of the simple ones being the naive. All right. These are those who do not know, have never heard, they never think of any kind of standard of divine morality. They're just what? They're just living their lives day to day in a hedonistic culture, giving themselves to whatever they want to give themselves to. So these are the simple-minded, the naive. You have the scoffers. For scorners delight in their scorning. We know today in our culture we have scorners, those who deny that Jesus or God exists, that deny that Jesus exists, that thinks the whole Christmas tradition and everything along that line is just made up by a bunch of people for no purpose, reason whatsoever. They're always going to mock moral principles. They're going to mock God. They're going to mock everything that God and his word stands for. So just understand, they had them back there in Solomon's day, and we have them today. And then he says, for scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. Fools is the ones who hate knowledge. They have no desire to inquire of the Lord. They're not trying to find out anything. So what is she trying to do? Verse 23, turn at my rebuke. She's trying to get them to repent, to submit to the instruction of the Lord. If we do, what happens? I will pour out my spirit on you. Now, immediately when I thought of that, I thought about Joel chapter 2, and then quoted in Acts chapter 2. But again, I don't know that that's where this should go. Simply the ideal of the spirit of wisdom is going to be poured out. And I will make known to you because, again, I have called and you have refused. I have stretched out my hand and no one regarded. And again, think about Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 13, where he brings out, I've called and you've refused. He said, you have disdained all my counsel and would have none of my rebuke. So what happens is they're rejecting wisdom. So he says what? I've stretched out my hand, I've called you, but because you've disdained all my counsel and would have none of my rebuke, what's going to happen? Verse 26. Here's the consequences. Number one, I will laugh at your calamity. What is calamity? Well, all the problems that's going to come because you purposefully reject what wisdom is trying to teach you. It's misfortune that's going to crush its victims. Here in this particular verse here, he says, what? I will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your terror comes. So again, he's emphasizing the idea of how does he say it? How does he say it? He says, your terror comes like a storm. Destruction comes like a whirlwind. When distress and anguish comes upon you. So again, think about the idea of the terror, a storm coming up, a tornado, of course, snowstorms are not that bad, but they can be destructive. Hurricane, things along that line. 1 minute, everything's fine. The next minute, everything's gone. He said, that's the way calamity is going to come. Now, what's interesting in this is as you're reading about this idea of trouble and darkness, distress and anguish, again, as we've talked about before, in the Hebrew, this is just a couple of words and it's using alliteration. Now, what is alliteration?
I'm taking a word, it doesn't have a meaning to it, but you come up with something to it.
Alliteration is like you have 2 or 3 words starting with the same letter. Okay. Anxiety and anguish. That would be and that's what we find here in this Hebrew word. It would be this same kind of idea. So it's just like they carry the idea, and again, this trouble and darkness, this distress and this anguish is coming upon you. The ideal in the Hebrew is it carries the idea that you get yourself in a situation and you have no way to turn around. You're cramped in. I am a man that I've had asthma all my life, and it's something I've struggled with. But one of my greatest fears is when the asthma kicks in, I know there's plenty of air out there, but I can't get it in. So don't get me in a confined spot. Now, I'm not so bad as some people that won't get in elevators and things like that, okay? But you get me in a spot with a lot of people around me and there's no room to move or something like that, this boy will be finding an exit as quick as he can. Now, that's kind of the same idea. Calamity's coming. You're going to be pressed in. You're going to be hemmed in. You have no room to maneuver. You have no place to turn. And so what? Your terror comes like a storm, just like the quickness of a storm. The whirlwind that carries everything away with it. So you have, number one, the calamity. Number two is the idea, they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me. All right? Some of the other translations put it, they will call on me and I will not answer. Again, the English Standard Version puts along that same idea. It's the idea of verse 26, I will laugh at your calamity. So, what? I'm going to mock you. I'm going to mock you at what you're going through. Wisdom will have the last laugh on the day when calamity comes. So think about it in regards to the day of judgment when God comes again. If biblical wisdom is based upon the moral goodness and the understanding of God, then what? He will have his last laugh, if you could call it a laugh. But it's a mockery. Verse 28 through 30, they will call on me. So now I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me. Because they've hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord, they would have none of my counsel and despise my every rebuke. The idea now, what happens is that the figure changes from I to then they will call on me, but I will not answer. It goes from first person and second person to third person. Those who are deemed fools by rejecting divine wisdom are no longer worthy of being addressed directly. So he said, I've called out to you, but they wouldn't listen. So now it's like, they will call on me, they will seek me, they. You hear that? They would have none of my counsel. So it's gone from first and second person, now to third person. Because he's not even talking about them anymore. Wisdom will no longer answer. Now look what happens. They will call on me. So obviously they're praying, asking for wisdom to help them. Well, if you're not getting it before the event, then what? It's not going to help you when you're facing the event, right? That's exactly too right. Late. And then if you're trying to call on wisdom at that moment in time, then what? It's too late to listen. Notice, they shall call, they shall seek, they will not find me. You hear the intensity. First they call, then they what? Seek is getting even narrower. They're really beginning to look now. They first called, now they're seeking, and then what? They will not find me in all of it. So they're earnestly seeking, rising in the morning, diligence and earnest. But again, there's the intensity of it. But wisdom would not repeal or will not what? Respond to their appeals anymore because they would not listen to her. Notice he said, they would have none of my counsel, despise my every rebuke. They shall eat the fruit of their own way and be filled to the full of their own fancies. For the turning away of the simple will slay them, the complacency of fools will destroy them. But whoever listens to me will dwell safely, and they will be secure and without fear of evil. So repentance is too late when the wheels of justice are in motion. And again, we've seen that probably in the day of judgment when God destroyed the world with a flood. You know, some people picture as they do it that people were beating on the doors of the ark, come in, and it was too late then, you know. It was too late for Sodom and Gomorrah to change, right? After the wheels of justice started. It was too late for the children of Israel to repent whenever Assyria and then later Babylon was knocking on their door. It was too late. Jeremiah encouraged them. God sent all these prophets, but they wouldn't listen. So then it was too late. And Jeremiah will tell them, even when Babylon is knocking on their door, the best thing for you to do now is surrender. And they still wouldn't listen. So again, how many people are maybe thinking, well, then when the Lord comes back again, that's when I'll deal with it. It's too late then. And again, why? They have made this decision. They would have none of my counsel. He said, wisdom is saying, in essence, I'm turning a deaf ear because now you're without excuse. During times of prosperity, we hate knowledge, and that's personal experiential knowledge of God. Now that things get bad, you cry out to God. Think about how often that happens. Where is God in the midst of all this judgment? Where he's always been, being the judge and the God of the universe, commanding and demanding people then what? To repent, and they choose not to. And then he says this, they will eat the fruit of their own way and be filled with the full of their own fancies. Again, some of the translations suggest the idea of having the fill of their own devices, suggesting that you reap what you sow. So they're filled with their own fancies. They shall eat the fruit of their own way, and it's going to make them sick. Okay, they're going to be nauseated. The ungodly counsels. Okay, all of that stuff's going on there in that respect. So now she's closing it up. For the turning away of the simple will slay them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But whoever listens to me will dwell safely and will be secure without fear of evil. Remember what I said through the course of the last 2 weeks. One of the things that we have a problem with sometimes if we try to absolutize some of these proverbs. And again, he says, whoever listens to me will dwell safely. Think about those first century Christians who listened to God, did what they said, and wound up giving their lives. So you could take this 2 ways. Did they dwell safely? Well, in one sense, yes, because after they were dead, they were dwelling safely in the arms of the Lord. But if you look at it strictly from a myopic view of this world, then no, they weren't dwelling safely. They lost their lives for what they did. So all of this comes in here. This waywardness, this thoughtlessness, this lack of care and concern for what God wanted would lead to their own destruction. And think about, again, this whole idea. They have had confidence in worldly wisdom. This confidence in worldly wisdom, and it often leads to a false sense of security. How often do we in America sit back and say, we've got the greatest military upon the face of the earth? And while we may, that doesn't necessarily mean a thing. It does, we put a society, and I like what he's emphasizing, what this one brother emphasized here, a society not built upon a firm moral foundation is doomed to collapse.
You go on YouTube and you look up Russia's military and China military, and it scares me.
Right. And we don't even have to look at that much as North Korea's military.
Yeah.
And they're ready. They're flat out ready.
When I see that, it reminds me of the arrogance of America.
Right. That's so true.
From what I'm seeing, you find anything on YouTube, and what I saw,
and
America still want to be arrogant, like people just want to roll over it.
Right. That's right.
No.
So, as we get through this first chapter here, this sets, like I said, the beginning of the tone for the book. And again, it emphasizes the idea that worldly wisdom versus godly wisdom. Paul will spend the first 2 or 3 chapters of the book of 1 Corinthians talking about the wisdom of the world versus the wisdom of God. The wisdom of the world rejects the idea of a slain Messiah. The wisdom of God says that's the only way you're going to be saved. So it's not like something, and again, this was something that I had never really thought about when I had gone through and read through the book of Proverbs 3 or 4 times. Now that I'm teaching it, it's like, wow, Paul got a lot of these ideas from Proverbs. He may not actually quote any of the Proverbs per se, but the very ideal itself of worldly wisdom versus godly wisdom is still there. And again, everything that we're talking about still has this application to us today. Now we get on into chapter 2. And like I said, the first 9 chapters are mainly the introduction to the book. So again, he's emphasizing now the value of wisdom. All right? He's talked about how wisdom has called. and how it is still the choice of every person whether or not they will choose to listen to what God says or listen to what the wisdom of the world says. So he emphasizes, now my son, let's read verses 1 through 4. If you receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you, making your ear attentive to wisdom, inclining your heart to understanding, yes, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord. So these first 4 verses and what we might say 5a, the first part of 5, talks about the idea, what is the purpose of this? What do I need to do? All right? Now, you must receive my words. You must treasure my commands. In other words, you must graciously accept the words of wisdom. You lay up, as it was, this in your heart. You're inclining your ear, okay? The ideal is sharpening the ear. Those of us that have hearing problems, a lot of times if I don't have my hearing aids in, then at that time I turn my good ear to somebody to hear what they have to say. And I think that's the same idea. The divine commandments need to be hidden away in the memory, in the understanding, in the conscience, in the heart. First, we have to hear those things. And then he says, you apply your heart to wisdom. You stretch out toward discernment. You're eager to absorb what is taught. The Bible appeals to the intellect as well as to the emotions. What's happened a lot of times in the Lord's church is we have developed a group of people that emphasize the intellectual knowledge of the Bible, and that's okay. But then there are another group of people out there that will talk more about the emotional aspects of the Bible. On the day of Pentecost, when Peter preached the gospel, he gave them the intellectual facts. Jesus died. We know this because, number 1, David prophesied about him being raised from the grave. Number 2, we're his witnesses. Number 3, the miracles that you yourself saw. There's the intellectual. He's appealing to the intellect. Then he gets on their hearts. You killed him. You killed Messiah. So, of course, on the day of Pentecost, you had people, 3,000 that day, who said, men and brethren, what shall we do? So we've got to have the balance. And again, sometimes it's so easy to go from one extreme to the other. You've got to have the balance in this. And I think he's emphasizing this. You're sharpening the ear. You're applying your heart. So now it's not just, you're not only receiving it intellectually, but you're applying your emotions to this as well. So again, a lot of times we may study something like this in a Bible class or a school of preaching situation like we're doing right now, and we may sit back and say, yes, that's right. But it isn't until it really becomes a part of our emotional character that it really begins to make the difference, right? So again, God in his wisdom has given us both. From the ear and then through the heart, the student must be focused on gaining wisdom. And again, notice here he says, if you cry out for discernment and lift up your voice for understanding. So now what? You're inclining your ear, you've got your emotions involved, and now you are actually asking the questions. You're crying out. You're lifting up your voice. Please help me to understand these things. So when you've got the intellect, emotions involved, then what? You have actions, right? So then what are you to do? If you seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden treasures. I was thinking about the idea that the search for wisdom must be unrelenting. It's like looking for what? Hidden treasures. We remember immediately Jesus' parable of the man who found the treasure in a field, who went and sold everything he had and bought the field just so he could have clear rights to the treasure. I have not seen any of the episodes. I have read some up about it, but the History Channel has this show on there, The Curse of Oak Island, that supposedly they think somewhere up in New England, there's an island off the coast that some supposed pirates have put a buried treasure in it. And they put in a series of traps. And what they've done is these guys that have more money than they've got sense, I'm sorry, they're pumping in all this money to try to get down into this area on this island just to see what's down there. And it's called the Curse of Oak Island because there have been 3 or 4 guys that have dumped tons of money in there just to try to find it. And lo and behold, you know, what happens is they get down or they start drilling or they do something like that. They hit a certain trap. The whole thing fills with water. They've got to pump all the water out. Just if you have nothing else to do with your time, maybe if you're just laying around just saying, boy, I'm bored, what can I do? And you want to be bored a little bit more silly, just watch the first episode or 2 and then you can find out more about it. But think about how the idea of hidden treasure appeals to us. You know, I've gone to Savannah and talked about the idea that during the time of the Spanish Main and all, there were pilots that had beached on Savannah. And you're sitting there thinking, wow, this would be neat if I found some treasure here, you know, like there hasn't been already bunches of people trying to find it. Well, that's what he says. This is what it is when it comes to what? Wisdom. It's like finding hidden treasure. It's like searching for silver. He says, when you do that, then you will understand the will of the Lord. And that's the important thing here. What are we wanting more than anything else? We're wanting to know God's precious will. We want to know him. So he says, this is what it is. Are you seeking it? Am I seeking it? When we eagerly pursue moral perfection, we will ultimately come to the fear of the Lord and the knowledge of God. And again, isn't it interesting? You will understand the fear of the Lord. You find the knowledge of God. For who gives wisdom? The Lord does. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He's a shield to those who walk uprightly. So again, to those that are righteous, to those that are walking in integrity, to those who are striving to the best of their ability to know God, God gives that wisdom. And so again, they are the upright. They're the ones that are walking in integrity. They're living their life by godly principles. One person has said this in a commentary, in the pulpit commentary: he who walks in integrity lives with the fear of God as his principle, the word of God as his rule, and the glory of God as his end. And think about how true that is. So he says, well, the Lord gives wisdom. That's where it all starts. It starts with him and wisdom. All right? From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He's a shield to those who walk uprightly. So those who are pursuing this understanding of God's wisdom will have a better understanding of 4 things. Verse 9. Then you will understand righteousness, justice, equity, and every good path. So it's God who gives us that wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He's a shield, a protector, someone who is there to guard this. So he watches over them, he's guiding them, he's protecting them. And then you will have, whenever you have godly wisdom, because you're walking in the way of God, you will understand what righteousness really is. Now, again, this righteousness is what? What is it? In the Bible, what is righteousness?
It's God's standards.
It's God's standards. But especially in the New Testament, this is extremely interesting to me. The word for righteousness and the word for justice are the same word. It's dikaiosune. And what's interesting about that, righteousness and justice, righteousness is doing what's right. Justice is doing what's right. So anytime you see the word justice in the New Testament, you could very well translate it righteousness. Anytime you see the word righteousness in the New Testament, you could very well translate it justice. How does that inform our ideas about those ideas today? Righteousness is doing what's right. How can we know what's right when everybody tells us there's no right way?
Now you got to fall back on wisdom.
You got to fall back on wisdom, and you got to fall back on where do you get your standard?
God.
Right. And again, those of us that are walking by the standard of the Bible, we've walked by that standard. But again, in a culture today that doesn't always do that doesn't even read the Bible, and I'm even talking about members of the church, when they're not spending time reading the Bible itself, then they're going to come across with concepts that are totally foreign to what the Bible clearly teaches. The idea that God is a God of love and will never cause anybody to go to hell. That is a foreign concept, and it is not a righteous concept, because it's saying that God is going to let people get away with everything. God always does what's right. Think about this ideal and the broader idea. Jim McGuigan, and he's written numerous books in the Lord's church, and many of his writings I really appreciate. There's some things I don't always agree with. Just like I'm sure people don't agree with everything I say either, so that's fine. But he makes the point that there has to be a punishment, there has to be a hell when you think about all of the wickedness and the injustice that's gone in the world today. When we often think about back to the 40s, when Hitler destroyed 6 million plus Jews, gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses and all these others. But we're not even counting what the Japanese did in their rapes and all of Nanking, and what they did in China. When you start kicking Stalin, when you start kicking in China and Mao Zedong, when you start kicking in Pol Pot, what happened in Cambodia, when you start think about how many, just literal races have been tried to be wiped out. Think about it again, and even justify it in one sense, some of the stuff that happened in America in the first few centuries, when we kicked out the American Native Americans. His point is, God's justice demands that these things be rectified. It will be. And so as we look at this, the more we understand God and the more we get into his word, the more we're walking, listening, eating his word on a day by day basis, then the more I can understand what justice really is. It's interesting that word is used so often by so many different people in so many different ways.
Yeah, and they use it without any understanding.
Without any understanding whatsoever. The white man a lot of time will justify what has happened in times past and in mistreating the black man and so forth. Well, I can't be held accountable for that. Okay, that's true. Now it seems like a lot of black people are saying justice and demanding that white men, and you actually read some of this on the internet now, they demand that white men just give up their home and give it to a black couple, a black family somewhere down the line. Both ideas are wrong. Okay, it's doing what's right. That's it. But the right standard is, again, God's standard. So he said, if you're following God, God is going to guard the path of justice, preserve the way of his saints. You will understand righteousness, justice, equity. What is equity? It's not what necessarily we put in there whenever we're putting something down as down payment, nor is it what we have in a house over a period of time. It's what? Equality. Being equal. Okay? So all of these things come into play here. All right? Also interesting here, he says that he uses the word equity and every good path. The word good path comes from a Hebrew word here, the Hebrew word magal, which means a wagon rut. So he says, whenever you are following God, then yes, you will understand righteousness, justice, equity, and a wagon rut. We talk about getting in a rut sometimes, but there are some ruts we need to get into and stay in. Walking the path of righteousness, doing what's right, doing justice, doing what God demands. Where does it all start? How can I know that we're doing what's right? How can you know what we're doing what's right? As we go through all of this, again, the only way we can know it is by God's word. All right? So, when wisdom enters your heart, he says, and knowledge is pleasant to your soul, discretion will preserve you. And understanding will keep you. So, again, it's now in your heart. It's something that what? Knowledge is pleasant to your soul. One of the things that I do enjoy, again, and part of the reason why I strive to teach is so that I can learn that much more. And again, this is what I've already come to, really learn. So knowledge is pleasant. I said, man, I didn't know that. I can't believe I've lived my life and didn't really think about it in these terms. Or I can't believe I've done this and not really saw it that way before. So do you enjoy learning something new? Do you enjoy learning something even newer about the Bible, something you never thought about before? Something that just, and again, we can make that a goal just to learn more, but that's not the goal. The real goal is what? To know God more, right? So the more I know about God, then the more I know about whenever I allow that wisdom to come into my heart. What is discretion? What is discretion?
Caution.
Caution. And again, to those people at that time, think about all that's discretion is the caution in making sure that it's going to preserve you. So we need the wisdom. We need the knowledge. Understanding will keep you. Discretion. So these are key words: wisdom, knowledge, understanding, discretion. All right? So all of those key words are involved there. What will it help us to do? Number one, to deliver us from the way of evil. Number two, deliver us from the men who speak perverse things. My daddy told me years ago, there's a sucker born every minute. And again, there are still people out there today that are what? Speaking perverse things. They will sell you Brooklyn Bridge if they think they can get away with it, right? And so, there it is. So again, wisdom, godly wisdom, understanding what God wants. And so that's the reason why he's writing this book, to teach this child, his son, stay away from the way of evil. Now remember back in chapter 1, he's already warned about what's going to happen if you follow the gangsters. So here's the reason why I'm writing it. He says, I want to deliver you from the path of the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things, from those who leave paths of uprightness, to walk in ways of darkness. So there are those that may have knowledge of God, but the wisdom and the desire of the world is that much more appealing. I could get my treasures now and later too. That's kind of what we would think about a lot of times. I want my treasures, I want my enjoyments now as well as later on. And the reality is, he says, you know what? He said, those who leave the paths of uprightness. Think about again in the New Testament how many warnings there are to Christians in the first century not to go back to Judaism. I'm firmly convinced the entire book of Hebrews was written to encourage Jewish Christians not to go back to Judaism, that they're having a better covenant with Christ. You think about the warnings in every New Testament book that warn us about the false teachers, and most of the warnings will bring out the idea that these false teachers will do what? They're gainsayers. They're wanting, as Paul would tell Timothy, to feed their own belly. Right? So think about how over and over and over again he's stressing these ideas. You don't need to follow somebody that's leaving the path of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness. These people rejoice in doing evil. They delight in the perversity of the wicked. Their ways are crooked. and they're devious in their paths. Son, I'm writing all this. Get wisdom so that you won't go the way of evil. You won't be listening to the guys that are going to try to sell you everything. You're not going to be listening to those that are walking away from God and away from the path of righteousness. You're not going to be delighting in the perversity of the wickedness. You're not going to be walking in the way of darkness. You're not going to be going that way that everybody else is going. But then he also gives this warning: to deliver you from the immoral woman, from the seductress who flatters with her words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. It's interesting here that in these 9 chapters, he's going to keep bringing this idea of sexual immorality up. And he does this trying to warn his son about these immoral women for the purpose of what? Keeping him away from them. Now, when we turn on our televisions at night, or at any other time for that matter, when we turn these ideas on, then what happens? That's what's thrown at us all the time, right? Yeah. And it's not only thrown at us, but it's also told us what? This is the way life really is. We can be married and divorced 15 times. It doesn't matter. We can be involved in all kinds of illicit relationships with as many as women as we want. You know, what does it show on television? Isn't it interesting? It's always interesting to me that a lot of the crime shows like CSI and some of these others, they will start off with loud music in a bar, and before it's over with, somebody in that bar is going to be dead. And think about how oftentimes it is a woman, and how they talk about how she had been raped and things along that line. And we're sitting there thinking to ourselves, well, that's horrible. But then we listen to actual news accounts where it seems like the incidences of rape are reaching higher levels. And now we're even hearing today more of the discussion about in Hollywood, how a lot of these leading directors and producers are talking about the sexual harassment of a lot of these. And it's not like these women didn't know when they walked into the situation. Mm-hmm. They're kind of told this is what's going to happen if you're wanting to get anywhere in this society. But now all of a sudden everybody's upset and frustrated. Well, we're just reaping the results of what the media has been feeding us all these years. And you see, when you're hearing this day in and day out, our young people grow up watching this stuff. If you're going to be rich, get into hip hop. You get into these. I've never watched them, but I never have figured out why anybody would want to watch. Obviously, there's some people that watch it. The Real Housewives of Atlanta. Who cares? You know. Yeah. And I speak back to, you know, and I guess I'm weird in that respect, but about the only shows I watch whenever I have a time to watch any of them, the only ones I ever watch are the shows I grew up with when I was younger. My wife sometimes sit back and think, well, why are you watching the rerun? Because nothing else is really worth watching. That's why.
No, I like to watch the black and white movies.
Yeah. So the point is, and what all is interesting to me is I was watching a show last night before I had to go to church, or right after I came home from services. May have been Tuesday night, but anyway, it doesn't make that much difference. It talked about some of the movies that were made in 1962. And I said, well, I've seen some of those, you know, and I thought, yeah, that's good. But there were other movies that I've never watched that as I was listening to this guy describe them, I'm sitting there thinking, I'm glad I didn't watch them. Because again, even back in 1962, they were starting to deal with issues of homosexuality, lesbianism, and things back then. In 62 now. But you don't hear that much about them, obviously, because again, those weren't blockbuster hits. But again, the stuff was being discussed even back then. Here's the point. And I don't want to, as I'm reading this, I'm seeing again the application today. This is why we need to teach our young people these things. As he gets very specific here in verse 16 and following about these women, right? Don't get involved with these women, these seductresses, these who flatters with the words, those who have forsaken the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. Isn't it interesting that when we think about the marriage covenant, all through Scripture, God brings out, it's not only a covenant between a man and a woman, but it's also a covenant between man, woman, and who? Because God is the one who set it up. Genesis chapter 2. So it's extremely interesting, especially to these Jews, the idea of forgetting the covenant of her God, that God in the Old Testament, what was the in the book of Leviticus, what was the condemnation when a woman and a man was found caught in adultery? Death. Why was that such a big deal? Because God understood and brings out the idea that marriage is the fundamental, basic cornerstone of society. When we have strong families, we have strong nations. When we're living by the standard of God, we're doing what God wants us to do, then we're going to have the happy marriages that God demands. What's a big problem in the church today? Again, going back to the 40s and 50s, you rarely ever heard of anybody ever getting a divorce. Now it seems like we spend hours and we have churches that don't have fellowship with one another because of differences over what God said about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Is it because the teaching about marriage, divorce, and remarriage is so hard? Or is it because we as men are trying to find a loophole to get out of our marriages so that we can get into another relationship? Is that really God's plan? As he starts off in the book of Genesis, he will emphasize the ideal of marriage. And then in the book of Malachi, he will say, God hates divorce. And then you pick up in the New Testament, and what do the Pharisees and so forth argue with Jesus about? Divorce and remarriage, right? So it's nothing new. But again, here's this woman. And son, stay away from her. Her house leads to death. Her paths to the dead. None who go to her return, nor do they regain the paths of life. It's going to ruin you. He said, I'm writing this so you may walk in the way of goodness. Keep to the paths of righteousness. For the upright will dwell in the land, and the blameless will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the earth, and the unfaithful will be uprooted from it. Let's take about a 5 or 6 minute break, and we'll pick up with chapter 3. All righty?
That's a mouthful right there.
Yeah. And again, think about how so much that fits in our society, right?
Yeah.
And how much it's needed. All righty. I hope everybody's there, and we'll go from there. This is another discourse beginning in Proverbs chapter 3. It's going to go, and actually from Proverbs chapter 1 through Proverbs chapter 9, there's going to be about 15 different lectures, you might say, or discourses or sermons on wisdom. In chapter 3, verses 1 through 18, you have the idea of here he's going to talk about the blessing of wisdom. This is what we might call to be the fourth discourse. It's continuing the same idea that we bring out in chapter 3, or excuse me, in chapter 2, but it's going to still bring out those very same ideas. So again, these various different discourses, and so we have this idea. Number one, the first speech here in chapter 3 emphasizes these 6 things. Number one is obey God. Do not forget my law. Let your heart keep my commands. For length of days and long life and peace they will add to you. Okay? So he's asking his son not to forget his teaching and his commandments. It doesn't mean just a temporary memory lapse like we all have, but a willful disregard from what we know of what God says. And why should we do it? Why? Number one, for length of days, long life, and peace they will add to you. Now, those are three reasons right there why we should continue in the law of God, right? Length of days. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that just because I study the law of God all of my life that I'm going to have a long life. I could leave here today and get killed in an automobile accident. But it's just that idea. It's the duration, you know. It's a godly principle. Living a godly life tends toward good health and therefore what? Longer life, right? Secondly, that ideal of long life, years of lives. Again, it's the ideal of the quantity. The godly life is an abundant life. We enjoy helping others. We enjoy putting something in there. A life of true happiness and enjoyment comes from being with your mate for all your life. And then he says, what? The godly life is one of peace, shalom, total well-being. He who follows biblical wisdom will experience contentment and tranquility and will be at peace. It doesn't mean he's going to have some hard times. But again, that's the emphasis that he's trying to bring out there. Keep my commandments, for you can do that. So number one, you obey God. Verses 3 and 4. Let not mercy and truth forsake you, and bind them around your neck, write them on the tablet of your heart, and so find favor and high esteem in the sight of man and God. All right? So he emphasizes the idea, remember God. Don't let mercy and truth forsake you. Tie them around your neck. So this ideal of mercy and truth, this idea, sometimes in some of the translations, it's kindness and truth. And the word mercy could be translated kindness, right? In the fact, so, you know, whenever you're doing this in Proverbs and Psalms, again, it's the idea of showing one another the helping hand, forgiving one another, sympathizing with those who are in trouble. That's what's involved in there. So, and then you think about the very word truth. What does that suggest? Again, is keeping your commitment, honoring your word, keeping God's commands, doing what you promised you were going to do to God, with God, but whenever you became and got in that relationship with God. So you think about it for just a minute, that kind of excludes hypocrisy. Yeah. You can't live two different lives. You know, so you write this, that's right. Where are you supposed to write them? On the tablet of your heart. Internalize them. Make them the mainspring of your life. Do all those things so that you bind them around your neck so you won't forget them. So you see here again is that idea. And why? You find favor with God, and favor and high esteem in the sight of God and man. A good reputation, grace. You'll be spoken of favorably and viewed favorably in that respect. All righty? So number one, the first thing is obey God. Number two, remember God. Number three, trust God. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Put your confidence in God. How much should you trust God?
With all your heart.
With all your heart. In other words, it ought to be a complete trust. Again, sometimes the only time I really study like I need to is whenever I'm trying to. The only time sometimes that I live like I'm supposed to is whenever it agrees with what I want to do anyway. But no, if you're going to trust in the Lord with all your heart, you're going to do what he tells you to do, even if it's not something that you would do. Now, let's take this as an example. In the Lord's church, we talk a lot about the ideal of forgiving one another. And we talk about the importance of forgiving one another. Jesus will tell us in Matthew 18:15-17 how we ought to handle it. If I have a problem with brother here, then I need to go between him and thee alone, right? What do we wind up doing? What is the inclination of man? Go tell everybody else. Yeah. Go tell everybody else. And it creates problems in the church. It creates problems amongst ourselves. It creates problems all the way around. If I know somebody has something against me, again, Jesus would say, if I've sinned against somebody, I need to go and work that out with him. And isn't it interesting that we do everything but that? Why? Because it don't go to our inclination. I'm mad. I don't want to talk to him. I don't want to share that with him because I'm very upset about him, and I just don't even want to talk to him right now. Well, is there ever going to be a good time that you talk with him? Well, the longer you sit there and let it fester, the worse it's going to get, right? But you see what I'm trying to say is that that's just one example. There are numerous other examples that we could use to talk about that. The Lord tells us to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, but I don't always know enough. I'm not always as prepared as I need to be. I don't have the time. I don't have the learning that the preacher does. I don't have and we give this long arm of excuse of not doing what the Lord tells us to do. He did promise us what?
Long life.
Well, he promised us that if we go and teach the gospel, he's going to be with us always till the end of the world. So again, all of those things come into play there in that respect. All right? So we need to trust him. Trust him. Don't just follow the divine guidance when it agrees with us. Trust him to do what he tells us to. Lean not on what? Your own understanding. Man's understanding in life is fallible. I don't know everything everybody else might know. I've not, in my life, let me put it this way, I've not gone out to the bars and got drunk. I've never done that because I've seen what it can do. I've seen it happen in my own family and in the situation that was involved with that. And so therefore, I'm not going to go out there and do that because I see what it can do. Well, somebody says, well, then you really haven't lived and you can't really speak about it. No, this place catches on fire. I can stand up and speak and say, let's get all out of here because if I don't, we're going to burn up. So you see, the reality is that sometimes I may not be able to speak to the dangers of drunkenness because I've never been drunk, but I still should be preaching about it. Okay. Okay. All righty. Now, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. What? In all your ways, what? Acknowledge. Know God in all your ways. So here, think about everything you do. You think to be thinking about God always, right? Thinking about God always. Giving him the glory always. In all your activities and all your pursuits of life, think about God. Every aspect of life should focus on God and walk in the spiritual life which he's provided. So it's not just acknowledging God when we come to worship. It's not just acknowledging God when I'm facing trouble. It's acknowledging God in every part of my life. So it's important that I do this. God, the Lord will direct his paths. So again, he's going to remove the things that impede progress. All right? In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your path. Now, what else does he say? Now, remember, we talked about here's the exhortation to obey God, remember God, trust God. Now, what's the fourth one? Here's the fourth one, reverence God. Folks, this will preach, won't it? I mean, this will really preach. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. It will be health to your flesh and strength to your bones. So it's the idea of reverencing him. Don't be wise in your own eyes. You ever met anybody that's arrogant? What is your reaction to them?
You just back off.
He's got all the answers, right?
Yeah.
Nobody knows everything about life, but he does, right? Yeah. And so the ideal is we do this sometimes. We need to be careful. We need to be careful. Godly reverence, again, is what? The function of life. That's what he's talking about here. This is the foundation of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the best corrective to one's own wisdom, right? Arrogance and conceit cause people to ignore all the warnings of both revelation and social convention. Self-trust is unwise and it's dangerous. So if I fear in the Lord, then what? It will cause me also to do what? First off, not to be wise in my own eyes, but secondly, to depart from evil. Stay as far away from evil as I possibly can. Again, does that not bring health and wholesomeness to our lives?
Yeah.
That should. But again, how often do we do this? How often do we engage in this? He said, therefore, you will find healthier flesh, strength, marrow is the actual word here for a healthy, healthier bones. All right. So again, reverencing God is very practical. It's the idea here that this is going to lead to a wholesome life, physical well-being, godly well-being. All of it's involved there. The bone marrow keeps the bones hard and strong and alive, and that's what God does for us. All right. So we are to obey God. We are to remember God. We are to trust God. We are to reverence God. Now we're to honor God, verses 9 and 10. Honor the Lord with what? With your possessions and with the fruits of all your increase. So your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. Okay? So he emphasizes that idea that and we're doing this so that we will be blessed. Now, again, in the wealth prosperity gospel is you give to me so that God will give to you, right? And it's out there. But again, I'm going to use my substance. No, I'm going to use the substance God gives me for his glory and for his honor. And again, I have to use it in ways that God will approve. Okay? So when we are dispensing our money in a way that brings God's glory, that's never ill spent. It's good spent, He will also emphasize Deuteronomy 18:4 and again in 26:2 that we are to give God the first fruits, right? God always emphasized to them, I own it all anyway. I blessed you with it anyway, right? So you need to give back a part of that to me to show your thankfulness and to show you what? Not only to show your thankfulness, but also to show you that, or to show me that what? You're trusting in me to take care of you. Again, how often do we do that? How often do we worry about the future? How often do we worry about whether or not we're going to have enough to retire on, or we're going to have enough to live off of, or whatever? Sometimes, again, much of that worry is ill-placed. We trust too much in ourselves. And by the way, when I'm emphasizing this idea, I'm not condemning making preparations for retirement. I am saying that sometimes we worry about it so much that we feel like we can never retire. What's he going to do? Whenever you're honoring God with your possessions, your barns will be filled with plenty. Your vats will overflow with new wine. Again, this is the grape juice that has not been completely fermented. Again, when we are trying to follow what God says, God is going to bless us, and there's going to be a material reward. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, it's one of the longest chapters of the Bible. In the first few verses, he says, if you follow me and keep my commandments, God says, I will bless you materially. You will have plenty to eat. You will have everything you desire. And he takes about 15 or 16 verses to say, this is what's going to happen if you really trust me. Then from about verse 15 through the end of the chapter, which I think has 68 or 69 verses on it, he said, this is what's going to happen if you don't. So again, he's just making this idea. Now, think about that was under the old covenant. Think about how richly we're blessed under the new covenant. We're blessed with Jesus Christ, walking with us, forgiving us of our sins, having a relationship with God that they didn't have. So you see, we are richly blessed in that respect. So we submit, we obey God, we remember God, we trust God, we reverence God, we honor God, we submit to God, verses 11 and 12. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor detest his correction. For whom the Lord loves, he corrects, just as a father does, or just as a father the son in whom he delights. This passage is quoted in Hebrews, the 12th chapter, emphasizing the idea to us that we must be willing to take the chastening, the correction of the Lord. All right? So sometimes we must allow God to punish us for the sins and the wickedness in our lives. God should not be forgotten in the time of prosperity. God should not be forgotten in a time of adversity. God should be there all the time. He ought to be there in every situation. So do not despise, he says. Do not hate those occasions of difficulty. What are we trying to do? We need to be willing to submit to it. What are you trying to teach me, Lord? What do I need to know? What am I getting wrong? How do I need to do better? So you see, if we don't, then what happens? Don't detest his correction. What happens if we do detest his correction? If we don't learn our lesson?
It's going to come back around again.
It's going to come back around again and again and again.
Yeah.
So whenever bad things happen, we need to follow our wisdom and we need to try to grow through those experiences. That's the reality to it. Misfortune either tends to draw people close to the Lord, or they say, where's God? And turn them back on God. And he says, let me tell you, this is what's necessary. This is what's necessary. So, verses 13 through 18, here's this blessing. The teacher continues. Now, happy is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gains understanding. For her proceeds, again, are better than the profits of silver, and her gain than fine gold. Now, here again, do you hear her being used here when it calls about wisdom? Again, she's using this feminine words to suggest the idea that wisdom is this way. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things that you may desire cannot compare with her. Length of days is in her right hand, in her left hand riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are all who retain her. Notice verse 13 and verse 18. Start with the words happy, and then end with the word happy or blessed, right? So as you're looking at this, here's the blessings. Here's the blessings of the man who's found wisdom. Number one, you have gained things better than silver and gold. Number two, wisdom is more precious than rubies. So you think about silver, gold, and rubies. These are things that the world runs after. He said wisdom is better than all of that. And all the things you desire cannot compare with her. Think about all the things we do desire. Length of days is in her right hand. You're going to live longer if you, and again, this is not an absolute, but this is what? A suggestion of what could happen if you're walking by wisdom. Her left hand riches and honor. Now, it's not always going to be true, but she's there. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, peace, life. So do you hear what he's saying? You're more richly blessed, number one. Number two, you have length of days. Number three, you have riches and honor. Number four, peace. Number five, life. And number six, blessedness, happiness, once again, comes from following after godly wisdom. Do we need to be teaching this to our young people?
Yeah.
Do we need to be teaching this to our older people?
Yeah.
So, again, as we look through this, we see this. Now, we come to another discourse here. And again, in my Bible, it's marked off by strong letters. And this next discourse is wisdom's place in creation. Verse 19 through 23 6, verse 19 through 26. The Lord by wisdom founded the earth. So while we're still today learning much of what God was trying to get across to us and learning his laws, God by wisdom founded the earth. He established the heavens. So here's the word: wisdom, understanding, and knowledge again is brought up. See that threesome over and over and over, that triad, that as it was here in this particular case, the ideal of what wisdom is all about: wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. All are tied together. So by wisdom he founded the earth, by understanding he established the heavens, by his knowledge the depths were broken up. So think about this: by wisdom God founded the earth. So what we're reading about here is what? Is creation. And what does that tell us about God? He didn't just throw it together. You know, I have seen my father and others take a piece of wood, cut it up into certain pieces, and make a nightstand out of it. My father-in-law can do the same thing. I have tried my hand at that sometimes, and it looks like a little 3-year-old trying to nail some stuff together. You know what I'm trying to say? It comes from wisdom. It comes from experience. When I think about it, how God, and I'm using a nightstand as opposed to just a bunch of wood laying there. Think about how God did that with nothing. He erected, okay? He founded the earth. By understanding, he established, he set up and erected the heavens. So here you have heavens and earth. The heavens and the earth. So here you have what? The whole universe, right? Now, in chapter 8, he's going to discuss this even more. In chapter 8, he's going to talk about wisdom's place in the creation. But just suffice it here, and again, what we're trying to do is go through the first 9 chapters because this is important, and then we'll try to hit the high points as we go through here. Secondly, by his knowledge, the depths were broken up and the clouds dropped down the dew. He's the controlling force of the universe. He not only created the universe, he is the controlling force of the universe. It will say in Hebrews chapter 1:3 that Jesus upholds all things by the word of his power. So isn't it interesting that he not only created the earth, but he's a controlling instance. So what did he do? The depths were broken up. Well, when did that happen? Think about that for a few moments. When were the depths broken up?
Was that the ocean?
I think so. I think what again happens is when you go back and read Genesis chapter 6 through 9 in great detail, it's interesting that in the book of Genesis, God will take Genesis 1 and 2 and talk about the creation, but he will take 3 chapters to talk about the destruction of the world and its recreation. And everything changes. Look very closely at the text, and you will see that the fountains of the deep were broken up. Isn't it interesting? He emphasizes here that the depths were broken up. So this comes back and harks back to what? Genesis chapter 6 or Genesis chapter 7 and 11, right? And the clouds drop down the dew. The rain. So again, think about it in that respect. Palestine, the country that this was written in, was totally dependent upon dew for moisture during the dry season. I mean, that's what they would talk about. So a lot of times as you read through scripture, it'll talk about the blessing of the dew of Hermon, which was the dew on the mountaintop up there. Why? They desperately needed good dew to be able to have any kind of crops whatsoever. So again, whether it is the creation of the world or a catastrophe in the world, God's hand had something to do with all of it. And that's what he's trying to emphasize to us. So he says, the Lord by wisdom founded the earth, understanding he established the heavens, by his knowledge the clouds were broken up. Now listen to what he has to say in 21 and 22. My son, let them not. Let them what? What does the them refer to? Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. So, and again, this is a simple thing of the simple English language and any other language for that matter. When you find a pronoun, try to find out what the pronoun is pointing back to, the antecedents. So don't let wisdom, understanding, or knowledge depart from your eyes. Keep sound wisdom and discretion, so they will be life to your soul and grace to your neck. So he emphasizes here, keep it, hold it. It's so powerful. Don't let this get away from you, depart from your eyes. Don't let it fade from your mind. Keep it with you all the time. Again, why? And because, again, she is a tree of life, chapter 3 at verse 18, and happy are those who retain her. And again, this should be grace around our neck. So the soul and the neck are standing for the whole person, the inner person, the outer person. It's all brought in together there. So here you have God's power, God's provision, and chapter 3, verse 23 through 26, God's protection. You will walk safely in your way, and your foot will not stumble. When you lie down, you will not be afraid. You will lie down, and your sleep will be sweet. Do not be afraid of sudden terror, nor trouble from the wicked when it comes. For the Lord will be your confidence, and will keep your foot from being caught. So, God created. Do not let this depart from your eyes, because God will walk with you safely in your way. Your foot will not stumble. You're walking securely. There's no anxiety or danger. There's nothing you're going to trip over. God's there. So again, you will lie down without fear. There will be no worry, no guilt to cause problems with you a little bit later on, right? You'll be able, and your sleep will be sweet. Why don't people today sleep? Stress. What are they stressing over?
Have no peace. Worries in life. Things we can't control.
And that's exactly right. We worry about life, things we have no control over. And again, if we're walking by wisdom, if we're living by wisdom, there should be nothing to worry about. And again, doesn't Jesus emphasize in Matthew the 6th chapter when he talks about the Sermon on the Mount that what good does worry do? And how often do we do it?
All the time.
And why? Because we're not trusting God enough, right? We're not looking to him for the answers. We're trying to find it every other way in the world that we can. Okay? There will be no unexpected calamity. You will not face, he can fearlessly face the destruction of the wicked. You know, don't worry whenever the wicked are going to be punished. Only a Christian can really say that, right? Because we're in the right relationship with God. Again, so when the wicked try to come to persecute us, don't worry about that. Even if it ends in our death, as in Stephen's case in Acts chapter 7, that's not the worst thing in the world, is it? So again, those who rely on God will have no feeling of helplessness. He's going to be there with us. He's going to keep our foot being caught in the snare. Now again, remember, let's not absolutize this, right? Because there are times whenever we might face those things and we're saying, where's God? That's where faith comes back in. God is walking with me. He has promised me never to leave me nor forsake me. Well, then why am I worrying about all this stuff this way? Why have I got an ulcer in my stomach? Why do I, have stress to the point that I might have a heart attack? Why do preachers not live that long sometimes? Because they have heart attacks and die. Because they're stressing out over all the things that we have no control over. I can't make people do what's right. I can encourage, beg, plead, but I can't make people do what's right. Should I worry about it? No. Do I worry about it sometimes? When it's somebody that I love very deeply and I see them walking down a path and they're doing something that I know is wrong and is going to wind up not good.
You know where it's going.
You know where it's going. What can you do? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. All right, let's get the last part here. Verse 27 through 35 of chapter 3. And then I think, because there's my birthday present, no, here's my Christmas present to you. I'm going to let you get out a little early tonight, okay? All righty? Can you handle that? Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. All right? Anyway. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in the power of your hand to do it. Do not say to your neighbor, go and come back, and tomorrow I will give it, when you have it with you. Do not devise evil against your neighbor, for he dwells by you for safety's sake. Do not strive with a man without cause, if he's done you no harm. Do not envy the oppressor, and choose none of his ways. For the perverse person is an abomination to the Lord, but with secret counsel is with the upright. The curse of the Lord is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the home of the just. Surely he scorns the scornful, but gives grace to the humble. The wise shall inherit glory, but shame shall be the legacy of fools. Here is what wisdom has done. Now, whenever we translate our wisdom into duty and action and lifestyle, then there are some things we got to do. Number one, here's some things regarding benevolence. What? There's 4 negative things here. Don't hold it from what is good. Do not say to your neighbor, go and come back. Do not devise evil against your neighbor, and do not strive with a man without cause. 4 different things, 4 different negative things that's involved here. In other words, you see somebody that needs good or needs something done for them, you do it when it's in the power of your hand to do it. Don't say to your neighbor, go and come back and tomorrow I will give it. And don't put them off. Okay? In other words, when you're in a position to do so and you have the opportunity to do so. Can you think of a New Testament passage that says the same thing?
Let's see what that one is. If you know to do good and you don't do it.
To him in sin. That's James 4:17. There's the negative part of it. But Galatians 6 verse 10 says, as we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto those who are the household of faith. So, this was James and Paul, influenced perhaps by these words from Proverbs that they probably had memorized, probably. And again, just brings them over to the New Testament, emphasizing that idea. Think about as well as this. The implication is that we really owe nothing or own nothing, right? Well, I own my house. Well, I see as how I just bought it about 1.5 years ago. I might own most of the doorknobs by now. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
But really, I don't own the house. When I die, it's going to be sold and it's going to be in somebody else's. So I really don't own anything.
When you want to get credit or something like that,
Right.
Are you a homeowner? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
You really have a mortgage.
Yeah. But we don't own it. Yeah.
Really.
We don't own it.
Not
We're
really.
we're the doorknob owners. You know what I'm trying to say in that respect. So again, this could have the implications of the poor claims that the people of Israel would demand from one another. So again, keep that in mind as you're looking at this as well. Remember, he would emphasize the idea that we're to help the poor. Under the Old Testament, they were to help the poor. Don't send them away saying, I'll do it tomorrow. That's just going to add somebody to worry, right? So, what am I going to do about today? I'm not sure. Don't devise evil against a neighbor who dwells securely. In other words, he's dwelling by you for safety's sake. He's not expecting you to do anything wrong to him. Don't do anything like that. Again, that violates trust from man, human law, and divine law. Don't do that. And what else? Don't pick a quarrel with somebody that you don't need to pick a quarrel with. Some people love to quarrel. They love to tell people off, right? Don't do that. Don't we are people of peace because we are the followers of the Prince of Peace. So we need to be trying to the very best of our ability to work things out to where what? We keep peace with everybody we come into contact with. Again, Paul will emphasize the idea in Romans 12, as much as lies within you, be at peace with all men, right? All right, so do not withhold good. Do not say to your neighbor, do not devise evil, do not strive with a man. Now, do not envy the oppressor. Now, he's going to give us some more warnings about the wicked. Stay away from them. Don't envy the oppressor. You know, you think about that for just a moment. Don't envy somebody that's going to practice violence, that are gaining riches by illegal means. You remember when he first started this book off with chapter 1, the first thing he said, don't go with these gangs that are going out there trying to get money quick. Don't do it. Stay as far away from it as you can. Choose none of his ways, for that person is an abomination to the Lord, right? He's an abomination. God, he's toeba. In other words, God is repugnant to the Lord. So again, worldly success and worldly wealth are not always a sign of God's favor. Right? And again, how many times does Paul have to remind, especially preachers, that in the book of 1 Timothy?
Yep.
So we have to think about it in that respect. The intimate are those who are going to have a relationship with God. The secret counsel that he has with God is with the upright. The perverse person is an abomination, but his secret counsel, God's secret counsel, his wisdom, his understanding, his knowledge, is with the upright. So again, don't do this. The course of the Lord is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the home of the just. So again, he emphasizes the idea. Those who gain riches by violence or fraud will not be allowed by God to enjoy the fruits of their wickedness. Now, when we get into the book of Ecclesiastes, and again, we're going to have to kick this up because this is third class, and so we're going to have to take about 3 more classes just to hit the highlights of Proverbs. Okay, I'm sorry, but there's so much to be said here. But I want you to think about this idea that one of the things he continually emphasizes is that God is going to punish the wicked. In the book of Proverbs, he's going to punish the wicked. God blesses the righteous here. The curse of the Lord is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the home of the just. He scorns the scornful. Think about it in this respect. He scorns the scornful. God is repaying them for what they themselves are doing, right? These are the ones who mock the precepts and the truths of God. So he repays their arrogant scorn with scorn. He frustrates them. He resists them. But the humble are those who what? God gives grace to. The wise shall inherit glory, but what? The foolish or the shame shall be the legacy of fools. So they earn the contempt of their neighbor in all of that. All righty? All righty. Well, that's enough. And we've got, let's just stop there. Again, I want to wish everybody a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. We will meet again January the 4th. Okay, we're not taking 2 weeks off. The Tuesday classes will meet January 2nd. We're meeting January the 4th so that we can hopefully end up the third quarter or the spring quarter in the middle of June instead of the last of June. Okay, so all of that, and probably in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to send information out to the teachers, let them see what they want to teach, and I'm hoping to have this new quarter set up no later than the middle of January. Now I put it out there. Now I've got to do it. So hold me to it and remind me to do that, okay? Brothers, I appreciate you so much, and I appreciate your work and your study and all that you do for the Lord. Keep on studying, and may God bless us all. Thank you.
Merry Christmas.
You what?
I said Merry Christmas to you.
Merry Christmas to you guys. Appreciate you so much. Hang in there.
Thank you.